Devonshire, September 1811. The appointment had been secured by Mrs. Thurley, which meant it had been secured with the brisk certainty of a woman who believed that children required structure, and that structure required a governess, and that the sooner one was installed, the sooner the household would stop fraying at every visible seam. The Duke of Ashgrove had 2 children. Rosabelle was 9, and had not laughed since February. Edric was 7, and had developed the habit of standing in doorways without entering rooms, watching the adults inside with the grave, cataloging attention of a child who has learned that people leave and has decided to keep count. The children had, in the space of 14 months, lost 3 governesses, or rather, the Duke had dismissed 3 governesses on the grounds that the first was too lenient, the second was too rigid, and the third had made his daughter cry over a mathematics error, which he had learned about at dinner from his son, who reported it with the calm devastation of a boy delivering a verdict he expected to be acted upon. It had been acted upon. The third governess was gone by Friday. Mrs. Thurley, who managed the household with the instinct of someone who had been doing it since before the Duke's first wife had died, understood 2 things about the situation. The first was that the children were not difficult. They were grieving, and grief in children does not announce itself. It hides inside bad behavior and silence and sudden tears over sums. The second was that the Duke was not unreasonable. He was afraid, and fear in fathers does not announce itself either. It hides inside high standards and rapid dismissals and the vigilance of a man who has already failed to protect his family from one catastrophe and is determined to prevent the next. She had written to an agency in Exeter. She had been specific in her requirements: patience over Polish, steadiness over accomplishment. Someone who understood that the position was not merely instructional, but structural. The children needed a fixed point, and the household had been without one since the Duchess had died. The agency had written back with a single name: Miss Catrienne Delvaux. She arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of September by post-chaise, with 1 trunk and a letter of reference from a family in Dorset that described her as exceptional with children and impossible to manage, which Mrs. Thurley had read twice and considered an endorsement. The Duke received her in his study. He did not stand when she entered. He was reviewing estate accounts, and he finished the column he was on before he looked up. Not rudeness precisely, but the habit of a man who had arranged his life so that nothing interrupted the order he had imposed on it. He looked at her. She was younger than he had expected. She had dark hair pinned simply and steady hands, and the posture of someone who was not performing composure, but who simply possessed it. She stood and waited without the small, anxious movements that the previous 3 had made in this room. "Miss Delvaux," he said. "Your Grace." "I will be direct," he said. "My children have had 3 governesses in 14 months. Each one failed. I do not blame the women entirely. The children are particular. They require someone who understands that this household has rules, and that the rules exist for reasons, and that affection, however well-intentioned, is not a substitute for discipline and order." He set down his pen. "Your role is to educate them, not to befriend them, not to mother them. They have had a mother. They do not need a replacement." The word landed in the room the way he had not intended it to, carrying more weight than the sentence could hold. She heard it. She heard everything underneath it. She said nothing. He continued. "The schedule is precise. Lessons begin at 8. French, arithmetic, history, music for my daughter, Latin for my son. Meals are taken in the nursery. You will report to Mrs. Thurley weekly on their progress. You will not alter the curriculum without my written approval." He paused. "Is that clear?" Her gaze moved from him to the study, the accounts on the desk, the books on the shelves that were organized by subject rather than author, the single portrait on the wall behind him of a woman with fair hair and an expression that suggested she had been painted mid-thought. She looked at all of it with the quiet, complete attention of someone reading a room the way others read documents. "Perfectly clear, Your Grace," she said. Then she did something none of the other three had done. She curtsied, not the shallow automatic curtsy of a woman accepting employment, but a slow, deliberate one, the kind that acknowledged his authority fully and without resentment, and held it for exactly the right duration, and then rose and looked at him directly and said, "I should like to meet the children now, if I may." It was not a request. It was not a challenge. It was the quiet, immovable statement of a woman who had heard everything he had said and understood everything he had not said, and had decided that the person who mattered most in this arrangement had not yet entered the room. He blinked. "Mrs. Thurley will take you to the nursery," he said. "Thank you, Your Grace." She turned and left the study, and the Duke of Ashgrove sat at his desk and looked at the door she had closed behind her, and thought, for the first time since the Duchess had died, that he had not controlled the interview. The children did not trust her. This was expected. Rosabelle sat at the schoolroom table on the first morning, with her hands folded and her gaze fixed on a point above the blackboard, with the practiced stillness of a child who had learned that if she gave nothing, nothing could be taken from her. Edric stood in the doorway. He did not sit. He watched. Catriane opened her satchel and took out not a textbook, but a bundle of dried lavender, which she set on the table between them without explanation. Rosabelle looked at it. Edric looked at it from the doorway. "My mother grew lavender," Catriane said, to neither of them in particular, in the way one might mention the weather. "She kept it in every room. I have never been able to work without the smell of it." She opened the French grammar and began the lesson as though the room were full and attentive. She did not ask Edric to sit. She did not ask Rosabelle to participate. She taught to the room itself and let the children decide what to do with what she offered. On the third day, Edric sat down. He chose the chair nearest the door, which she noted and did not comment on. On the fifth day, Rosabelle asked a question about irregular verbs, a genuine question, not a performance of compliance. And Catriane answered it with the same steady attention she had given everything else, and did not make the mistake of treating the question as a breakthrough. It was a question. She answered it. The world continued. By the end of the second week, she had identified the shape of the problem. The children were not behind in their studies. They were, in fact, unusually capable. Rosabelle had a natural ear for languages, and Edric could hold sequences of numbers in his head with the effortless retention of someone who had not yet been told this was remarkable. The problem was not academic. It was architectural. The previous governesses had tried to fill the role the Duke had described: instructor, disciplinarian, enforcer of schedules. The children had responded to each one the same way: compliance without trust, obedience without connection, the mechanical performance of learning without any of the thing itself. They had been managed. They had not been met. On the fourth evening, Catriane heard a sound from the nursery corridor while she was reading in her room. She went to the door and found Edric standing in the hallway in his nightclothes, not crying, not calling for anyone, just standing in the dark with one hand on the wall, as though he had come out to verify that the corridor was still there. She did not ask him what was wrong. She sat down on the floor beside him, with her back against the wall, and said nothing. And after a time he sat down too, and they sat together in the dark corridor for 10 minutes in complete silence. And then he stood up and went back to his room, and she went back to hers, and neither of them mentioned it in the morning. She understood then, not as theory, but as certainty, that these children did not need instruction. They needed proof. Proof that the next person would not leave. Proof that steadiness existed. Proof that an adult could sit in a dark corridor and not require anything from them in return. Catriane did not alter the curriculum. The Duke had been explicit about that, and she had no intention of testing his authority on a matter he clearly considered foundational. But she altered the space around the curriculum in ways he had not thought to forbid. She opened the schoolroom windows in the morning, because the room faced east, and the September light came through the old glass in a way that changed the quality of the air. She moved the lessons outside on warm afternoons, French under the copper beech, arithmetic in the walled garden with stones for counting, history told as stories rather than dates, while they walked the long path to the lake. She did not ask permission for any of this. The Duke had said she could not alter the curriculum. He had not said she could not alter where it was taught, or how the room felt while it was being taught, or whether the children were permitted to be comfortable while they learned. It was, she understood, a distinction he would eventually notice. She was not concerned about that. She was concerned about Rosabel's silence and Edric's doorways, and the way both children flinched when a door closed too loudly, and the particular quality of attention they gave to any adult who entered the room. The swift, evaluative attention of children, who were measuring whether this one would stay. Mrs. Thurley noticed the changes within the first week. She said nothing to the Duke. She had her reasons, and they were not complicated. The children had eaten breakfast without being prompted for the first time since March. She was not going to interfere with whatever had caused that. She did, however, mention it to Cook, who mentioned it to the head gardener, who mentioned it to no one, because the head gardener was a man of few words, but who began leaving small bundles of lavender from the kitchen garden on the schoolroom windowsill without being asked. The Duke discovered the outdoor lessons on a Tuesday in the third week, later than Catrienne had expected, telling her something about how infrequently he visited the parts of his own estate where his children spent their days. She was in the walled garden with both children when he appeared at the gate. Edric was sitting on the low stone wall with a slate, working through multiplication tables with a concentration that was genuine rather than performed. Rosabel was reading aloud from a French primer, her pronunciation careful and increasingly confident, and she was sitting on the grass, not where a Duke's daughter was conventionally expected to sit during lessons. The Duke looked at this tableau. He took in the open primer and the slate, and his daughter on the grass, and his son on the wall, and the governess standing between them with her hands clasped behind her back, and lavender in her buttonhole, and an expression that was not apologetic. "Miss Delvaux," he said, "Your Grace." "The schoolroom," he said, "is indoors." "It is," she agreed. "And yet," he said, looking at the arrangement before him with the complete assessing attention she recognized from the study, the one that preceded a position already decided, "the lesson appears to be taking place outside." "The curriculum is unchanged, Your Grace. French grammar, the irregular subjunctive. Rosabel is on page 43, which is ahead of the schedule you provided." She paused. "The location was not specified in your instructions." He looked at her. She held his gaze with the same steady composure she had brought to the study on her first morning, the one that was not a performance. Rosabel had stopped reading. Edric had stopped his sums. Both children were watching the exchange with the alert, breath-held attention of children who had seen this before, an adult they had begun to trust, and the father they loved, and the moment where one of them would be sent away. Catrienne saw it. She saw both children go still in the particular way of small animals who have learned that stillness is the only strategy available to them, and she understood, in that moment, with the precision she brought to all important things, that whatever she said next would be heard by the children not as a professional response, but as an answer to the question they had been asking since February. "Will you stay, or will you leave like the others?" She looked at the Duke. "If you wish me to return to the schoolroom, I will do so immediately," she said. Her voice was calm and without defiance. "But I should like to note that Rosabel asked her first voluntary question on the 5th day, and Edric chose to sit at the table on the 3rd, and both of those events occurred in this garden, and I do not believe they would have occurred in the schoolroom." The Duke was silent for a long moment. He looked at his daughter on the grass. He looked at his son on the wall. He looked at the slate, where Edric's multiplication tables were written in a hand that was steadier than it had been in months. "Continue," he said. He turned and walked back through the gate without further comment. Rosabelle watched him go. Then she looked at Catrienne with an expression that Catrienne had not yet seen on the child's face. Not relief precisely, but the cautious beginning of something that relief might grow into if it were given enough time and not disturbed. Edric picked up his slate and returned to the multiplication tables, and the small, deliberate act of resumption told Catrienne more about the boy than any report card could have. He had not waited to see what happened. He had heard the word continue, and had trusted it immediately, which meant he was beginning to trust the architecture around him, which meant the architecture was holding. Catrienne stood in the walled garden and watched the Duke's retreating back, and thought about the word continue, and what it had cost a man who controlled everything to say it, and what it meant that he had said it in front of the children, who had heard it, and who had received it not as permission, but as something closer to a promise, the kind that fathers make without knowing they have made them, and that children hold to with a tenacity that no contract could match. October arrived with the golden weight that Devonshire carried in autumn, the light lower and warmer, the trees along the estate drive turning in the slow, certain way of trees that had been doing this for longer than anyone's claim to the land beneath them. Catrienne had been at Ashgrove for 5 weeks, and the household had changed in the way that households change when a load-bearing element is quietly inserted, not dramatically, not with announcement, but in the small structural shifts that accumulate until someone looks up and realizes the building is no longer creaking. Rosabelle laughed on a Wednesday. It was not a large laugh. It was the small, startled laugh of a child who had forgotten she could, prompted by something Edric had said during a Latin exercise. A deliberate, deadpan mispronunciation that was, Catrienne understood, a joke, which meant that Edric had decided the room was safe enough to be funny in. She treated the laugh as ordinary. She did not look up from her book. She did not draw attention to it. But Mrs. Thurley, who had been passing the open schoolroom door with a stack of linens, stopped in the corridor and stood very still for a moment, and then continued walking, and said nothing about it to anyone, and went to her room that evening and sat in the chair by the window, and was grateful in the manner that doesn't require an audience. The Duke began appearing. Not at lessons. He had conceded the garden without formally acknowledging the concession, and he was not a man who revisited ground he had already given. But he appeared at the edges of the Children's Day in ways he had not done before. He was in the breakfast room when they came down in the morning, which Mrs. Thurley noted was new. He was in the library when they passed through after lessons, reading in the chair by the south window, positioned so that the library door was visible from where he sat. He asked Edric about his Latin at dinner on a Thursday, and Edric answered with more words than he had used at dinner in 6 months, and the Duke listened with the stillness of a man hearing something he had been waiting to hear. He asked Rosabelle about her French on a Friday, and Rosabelle answered, and then, without prompting, without performance, told him about the copper beech tree, and how Miss Delvaux had explained the subjunctive by describing what the tree would do if it could choose its own season, and the Duke looked at his daughter, telling him a story with animation in her face for the first time since he could remember, and he did not speak, because speaking would have required him to manage the moment, and he did not want to manage it. He wanted to sit in it. He wanted to understand why his daughter was telling him about a tree with the enthusiasm she used to bring to everything, and why the answer was a woman who had been in his house for 5 weeks and had done nothing he had asked and everything his children had needed. His mind went to the study, to the interview, to the words, not to mother them, and the way Miss Delvaux had curtsied, and then said, "I should like to meet the children now," as though she had heard his entire speech and decided to respond only to the part that mattered. Later that evening, he asked Mrs. Thurley a question he had never asked about any of the previous governesses. "Is she settling in?" Mrs. Thurley, who had been managing this household long enough to understand exactly what was being asked and how much was contained in its 5 words, said, "The children are settled, Your Grace." She held his gaze with the composure of a woman who had said precisely what she meant. "That is not what I asked," he said. "It is, Your Grace," she said. "It is exactly what you asked." He was quiet for a moment. He considered arguing the point. His housekeeper had just corrected him with the same calm immovability that Miss Delvaux had used in the walled garden, and wondered briefly whether the 2 women had been coordinating, and then decided it did not matter because the result was the same. He was being managed gently and without apology by the women in his own house, and the house was running better than it had in over a year. Then he returned to the estate ledger on his desk, and Mrs. Thurley left the study, and the door closed behind her with the soft, definitive sound of a woman who had planted a seed and was content to let it grow on its own schedule. November came in with rain, not the dramatic storms of the coast, but the steady, patient rain of inland Devonshire, the kind that settled into the landscape and did not intend to leave, and that turned the estate grounds into the particular shade of green that only existed when the world had been thoroughly and unapologetically wet for a fortnight. The outdoor lessons moved inside, which Catrienne managed without ceremony, and the children accepted without complaint, because the schoolroom had changed in the weeks since she had arrived. It was no longer the room they had endured under the previous 3. The windows were still opened each morning, even in the cold. The lavender was still on the sill. Rosabel's watercolor of the copper beech, done during a drawing lesson Catrienne had introduced under the heading of geometry, because the Duke's curriculum included geometry, and she had decided that perspective drawing qualified, was pinned to the wall above the bookcase. The room had become theirs. The way spaces become someone's when they are used with intention and without fear. Edric no longer stood in doorways. He still chose the chair nearest the door, which Catrienne had noted and filed as information rather than concern. A preference, not an escape route. Not anymore. The shift had happened gradually, in the way that trust builds in children who have learned to be careful with it. Not in declarations, but in the slow accumulation of evidence that the world was holding steady. He sat closer to the table now. He asked questions. He had begun, in the past week, to correct Rosabel's Latin pronunciation with the matter-of-fact authority of a younger brother who has discovered he is right about something and intends to be thorough about it. This was, Catrienne understood, an act of extraordinary confidence. It meant he believed the room would survive a disagreement. The Duke came to the schoolroom on a Thursday evening. This was unprecedented. He had never entered the schoolroom. He had appeared at its edges, the breakfast room, the library, the garden gate. But the schoolroom itself was territory he had ceded without discussion, and his arrival in the doorway at 5:30, when lessons were finished and the children were reading quietly before supper, carried the weight of a man crossing a line he had drawn himself. Edric looked up. Rosabel looked up. Catrienne, who was at the desk reviewing the next week's lesson plans, looked up and saw in his expression something she had not catalogued before. Not the assessing attention, not the controlled authority, but something less managed, something that resembled uncertainty in a man who did not often experience it. "I came to see the room," he said. It wasn't an adequate explanation, and they both knew it. She stood. "The children were just finishing their reading," she said, offering him the social scaffolding his arrival had not provided for itself. He walked into the room. He took in the lavender on the sill, and the watercolor on the wall, and the books arranged by the children's preference rather than by any system he recognized. He noted the 2 chairs at the table, Edric's near the door and Rosabel's by the window, each one positioned exactly where its occupant wanted it. not where the previous arrangement had placed them. He looked at all of it the way he looked at estate accounts, reading what the details said about the structure beneath. "Rosabelle," he said, "show me the watercolor." Rosabelle looked at Catriane. It was a brief look, the reflexive check of a child who has an ally and wants confirmation before proceeding, and Catriane gave the smallest nod, and Rosabelle stood and took the watercolor from the wall and brought it to her father and explained the copper beach and the perspective lines and the way Miss Delvaux had shown her how the branches created angles that could be measured, and the Duke listened and held the painting and said, "This is very good." 3 words. Ordinary words. But Rosabelle's face did something that Catriane watched with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what she was seeing. A child receiving approval from the parent she loved most, in the room where she had learned to feel safe, and the two things combining into something the child had not had since her mother died. The Duke handed the watercolor back. His gaze found Catriane across the schoolroom with an expression she was going to have to think about later, when the children were not watching, and said, "Good evening, Miss Delvaux." "Good evening, Your Grace." He left. Rosabelle pinned the watercolor back on the wall with careful hands. Edric returned to his book, and the evening continued as though nothing remarkable had occurred, which was not true, but was the correct way to hold it in the presence of 2 children who needed remarkable things to feel ordinary before they could trust them. The Michaelmas Assembly at Thornfield Hall was the county's principal autumn gathering, 40 families, the full social machinery of the district. Catriane was not invited. Governesses were not invited to assemblies. This was understood by everyone, and would not have been worth mentioning except for the fact that the Duke, for reasons he did not explain to Mrs. Thurley, and which Mrs. Thurley did not ask him to explain, because she had spent 30 years understanding this family, and did not require explanations for things she could read in a man's hesitation, asked whether Miss Delvaux might attend as the children's companion, given that Rosabelle was old enough for limited social exposure. Mrs. Thurley said she would make the arrangements with the composure of a woman who was not going to comment on what had just happened. Catriane arrived at Thornfield Hall in the dark green dress she had brought from Dorset, the only formal dress she owned, well made and simple, and carrying the unmistakable quality of a garment that belonged to a woman of modest means and excellent taste. She had Rosabelle beside her, in the blue dress Mrs. Thurley had chosen, and Edric, who had been included, because excluding him would have required explaining to him why his sister was going, and he was not. And the Duke had discovered over the past 2 months that explaining things to Edric increasingly required the kind of argument he was no longer certain he could win. The assembly proceeded as these things did. Catriane stayed with the children. She did not circulate. She did not presume. She was aware of her position with the precision of someone who understood where the boundaries of her situation fell. She talked to the vicar's wife, who was kind, and to Mrs. Aldworth, who asked about Rosabelle's progress with a warmth that was either genuine or expertly performed, and Catriane answered with enough to be polite and not enough to be interesting, because interesting attracted attention, and attention attracted opinion, and opinion in a county assembly could be a currency or a weapon, depending on who was spending it. She was aware that the Duke was across the room. She had developed, over 2 months of proximity, a working understanding of where his attention was directed, and it was, with a frequency she had noted and was not going to account for, directed at the corner where she stood with his children. Lady Hathwell arrived at her elbow. Lady Hathwell was 63, and had been the social authority of the district for 9 years, a position she had assumed with the inevitability of someone who had been preparing for it since 40. "Miss Delvaux," Lady Hathwell said, with the smile of someone who had been composing a remark for 20 minutes. She had been composing for 20 minutes. "The children look very well indeed. One might almost think they had a mother's influence rather than a governess's." The room around them did not go quiet, because rooms at assemblies do not go quiet. They modulate. the nearest conversations dimming just enough to accommodate the interesting thing happening in their vicinity. Catrienne felt the modulation. She understood its meaning. She understood that Lady Hathwell wasn't complimenting the children. She was drawing a line between what Catrienne was and what Catrienne was not, and drawing it in public, where the line would be witnessed and remembered and would define the terms of every future interaction. She was formulating her response, calm, precise, the kind that acknowledged the remark without dignifying the implication, when Rosabelle spoke. "Miss Delvaux teaches us in the garden," Rosabelle said. She said it to Lady Hathwell directly, with the clear, unhurried voice of a child who did not understand the social architecture of what was happening and was simply telling the truth. "She knows all the trees by their proper names, and she can identify 17 species of bird by their call, and she sat with Edric in the corridor when he couldn't sleep, and she didn't make him talk about it." The room modulated further. Lady Hathwell's smile underwent a recalibration. Catrienne felt something in her chest that she was going to have to manage carefully, because the child had just offended her with the most devastating weapon available, complete, unperformative honesty, and had done it without knowing it was a defense at all. The Duke appeared. He had crossed the room, which Catrienne had not seen him do, which meant he had moved quickly, which meant he had been watching. "Lady Hathwell," he said, in the voice Catrienne had not heard before. Not the study voice, not the garden gate voice, not the schoolroom voice, but the one beneath them all, the one that carried the full weight of the Ashgrove title and knew exactly what that weight could do. "Miss Delvaux has transformed my children's education in 8 weeks. I consider the household fortunate to have her." He looked at Lady Hathwell with the complete, still attention of a man who was not making a social remark, but issuing a correction. "We are all agreed on that, I think." Lady Hathwell agreed. The room agreed. The modulation reversed. The conversations resumed their normal volume, and the moment passed into the category of things that everyone present would remember and discuss in private, and never mention directly again. Catrienne stood in the aftermath and thought about what had just happened. Rosabelle's voice echoed. She sat with Edric in the corridor, and Catrienne understood that the children had been keeping an account of her more complete than any report she had filed with Mrs. Thurley. The Duke had crossed the room. The word, fortunate, and the way he had said it, and the fact that he had said it, at all. He found her in the library the following morning. She was there before the children, as she always was. She used the hour between 7 and 8 to prepare the day's lessons, and had been given informal use of the Ashgrove Library by Mrs. Thurley, who had the authority to grant such things and the wisdom to grant them without consulting the Duke, because consulting the Duke would have required him to make a decision about proximity that Mrs. Thurley preferred to let happen without the inconvenience of discussion. He came in and closed the door. She stood because he was the Duke and she was the governess, and the room required it, and because standing was easier than sitting when she did not know what was coming. "Please sit," he said. She sat. He did not sit. He stood by the window that faced the walled garden, where the November rain was falling on the copper beech and the stone wall where Edric had done his multiplication, and he looked at the garden for a moment before he turned to face her. "Last night," he said, "at the assembly. Your Grace, Lady Hathwell was impertinent," he said. "You should not have been subjected to that. I should have anticipated it, and I did not, and I am sorry for it." She looked at him. He was apologizing. He was apologizing to his children's governess for the behavior of a county matriarch at a social gathering, which was not something dukes did, and both of them knew it. Lady Hathwell expressed an opinion, Catrienne said carefully. The opinion was her right. The opinion was designed to diminish you in public, he said. That is not a right. It is a habit, and one I should have interrupted before my daughter was required to do it for me. He stopped. He looked at the garden again. She sat with Edric in the corridor, he said quietly. That is what Rosabelle said. Catrienne was still. She told the room something I did not know, he said. My son could not sleep, and you sat with him in the dark, and you did not tell me. You did not report it. You did not include it in the weekly summary to Mrs. Thurley. No, Catrienne said. Why not? She considered the answer, and what the honest version of it would cost, and about whether the honest version was owed or merely available, and decided it was both. Because it was not yours to manage, she said. Edric did not need a decision made about his sleeplessness. He did not need a doctor called, or a routine adjusted, or an investigation into the cause. He needed someone to sit with him. That is all. And I did not tell you, because telling you would have turned it into a problem to be solved. And it wasn't a problem. It was a child standing in a corridor in the dark, and it required presence, not policy. The room was quiet. The rain fell outside. The Duke looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the assessing one, not the authority, not even the uncertain one from the schoolroom visit. This one was undefended. This one belonged to a man who had just been told that his approach to his own children, careful, structured, managed, had missed something fundamental, and who was hearing it from the woman who had caught what he had missed, and who was not angry about it, and was not leveraging it, and was simply telling him the truth with the same steady composure she brought to irregular verbs and perspective drawing and everything else she touched. I have been wrong about this household, he said. Not wrong, Your Grace, she said. Incomplete. The word landed differently than she had expected. Incomplete, he repeated. The structure you built for them is sound, she said. The schedule, the curriculum, the rules, they needed those things. Children need boundaries, but boundaries are architecture. They are not warmth, and your children needed both, and you provided one and forbade the other, and I think you know why you did that. The pause was long enough to hold everything. My wife, he said. She was warmth without structure. She loved them enormously and managed nothing, and when she died, the warmth left with her, and I was left with the structure, and I decided the structure was what had been missing all along. He stopped. I was wrong. You were grieving, she said. You were building the thing you could control because you had lost the thing you could not. Rosabelle told the room about the corridor, he said. She told a room full of people that you sat with my son in the dark, and I didn't know it had happened. And the fact that I didn't know is the most precise indictment of my parenting I have ever received. It was not an indictment, Catrienne said. It was a child telling the truth about someone she trusts. She was not judging you. She was describing me. His gaze held hers. That may be worse, he said. That she described you, and the description was of someone who does the things I should have been doing. You are doing them, she said. The schoolroom visit, the breakfast room, the questions at dinner. You are doing them now. Because of you. Because of your children, she said. They were always worth it. You simply needed someone to rebuild the path back to them. He looked at her for a very long time. The rain continued. The library was warm, and the morning was gray, and the space between them held something that neither of them was going to name today, because today was for something else. Today was for the reckoning, which had arrived on its own schedule and was not going to be rushed. December at Ashgrove had its own rhythm, the shorter days drawing the household inward, the fires lit earlier, the children's lessons ending at 4 when the light went, and the house settling into the particular intimacy of a large building in winter, when all the life contracts to a few warm rooms and the distances between people become shorter without anyone arranging it. Rosabelle had begun reading aloud after supper. This was new, She read to Edric in the schoolroom, sometimes French, sometimes English, sometimes from a book of myths that Catriane had found in the library and introduced under the heading of classical history, because the curriculum included classical history, and she had decided that myths qualified, in the same way that perspective drawing qualified as geometry, and the Duke had not objected to the myths any more than he had objected to the drawing, which Catriane had noted and filed alongside the growing collection of things the Duke had not objected to, which was becoming, she thought, a more interesting document than the things he had. The Duke began staying for the readings. This happened without announcement or arrangement, in the way that the significant things in this household always happened. He was simply in the library one evening when Rosabelle was reading, and he did not leave, and the following evening he was there again. And by the third evening, Edric had moved his chair so that it was positioned between his father and Miss Delvaux, possibly the strategic thinking of a boy who wanted both of his fixed points in range, or the instinct of a boy who had decided where he belonged and was not interested in anyone's permission to be there. On the fourth evening, Rosabelle was reading a passage about Persephone's return from the underworld, and she stopped mid-sentence. Catriane looked at the girl and saw that she had stopped, not because she had lost her place, but because something in the passage had found her, and the thing it had found was personal, and too large to continue over. That is how it felt, Rosabelle said quietly. She was not looking at the book. She was looking at the fire. When Miss Delvaux came, it felt like that. The room held the sentence. Edric was still. The Duke was still. Catriane was still in the way of a person who has been given something precious by a child and understands that the wrong movement will break it. Like winter ending, Rosabelle said. Then she returned to the book and continued reading, and the evening went on, and no one responded to what she had said, because responding would have required managing it, and the room had learned, from the woman who had taught it, that some things did not require management. They required witness. The Duke found Catriane in the corridor afterward. The children were in bed. The house was quiet in the particular way of December nights. The fire crackle, the distant sound of Mrs. Thurley's keys, the old wood settling into itself. "What Rosabelle said," he began. "Yes," Catriane said. "She compared you to Persephone's return." "She compared the feeling of your arrival to the end of winter," Catriane said. That is what she said. He leaned against the corridor wall. It was the most informal thing she had ever seen him do. His gaze went to the ceiling, and then to her, and then at the corridor itself, as though the architecture of his own house had shifted without consulting him. "When I hired you," he said, "I told you not to mother them. You did. I told you that affection could not replace discipline. You did. And you curtsied, and asked to meet the children, and then proceeded to do every single thing I told you not to do. And my children are happier than they have been since their mother died." She looked at him. "I did not do what you told me not to do," she said. "I have not replaced their mother. I have not pretended to be their mother. I have been precisely what I am, their governess, who teaches them French and arithmetic and the names of trees, and who sits in corridors when sitting in corridors is what is required." She paused. "What you forbade was replacement. What I provided was presence. They are not the same thing." He looked at her in the dim corridor light. "You make very precise distinctions. I find precision useful," she said. "It prevents misunderstanding. It also prevents people from getting close to you," he said. She was quiet. It was the first personal observation he had ever made about her. Not about her teaching, not about her methods, not about her effect on the children, but about her. About the way she held herself at a measured distance from everything and called it professionalism when it was also, he suspected, something else. "That is not your concern, Your Grace," she said, but her voice had shifted. Not much. Not enough for anyone but a man who had been listening to it for 3 months to notice. But he had been listening to it for 3 months, and he noticed. "No," he said. "It is not." He straightened from the wall. "Good night, Miss Delvaux." "Good night, Your Grace." He walked down the corridor toward his own rooms. She stood where she was for a moment, in the dim light, with the sound of the house settling around her, and thought about what had just happened. The personal observation, the thing he had seen about her, that she had not expected anyone to see, and the fact that he had named it, and the fact that she had deflected it, and the fact that the deflection had not worked. Was the distance she maintained structure or armor, and whether there was a difference? Christmas at Ashgrove was traditionally an estate occasion, the tenants' dinner on the 23rd, the household gathering on Christmas Eve, the family chapel on Christmas morning. The Duke had maintained these traditions since his wife's death with the mechanical precision of a man performing rituals he no longer inhabited but could not abandon. This year was different. Rosabelle had asked, not been instructed, whether she could help Mrs. Thurley with the arrangements. Mrs. Thurley had said yes with the studied calm of a woman who was not going to cry in front of a 9-year-old, and had then gone to her room and sat in the chair by the window for 3 full minutes before returning with a list of tasks. Edric had asked whether the tenants' children could come to the schoolroom on the 23rd. He had phrased it as a logistical question. "There are 11 of them, and the schoolroom can hold 14, which was his way of making requests by presenting them as solved problems. The Duke said yes, and the thing that those 3 seconds replaced, last year's December, silent and endured, was felt by everyone and named by no one. The tenants' children came on the 23rd, 11 of them between 4 and 12, and sat in the schoolroom with Rosabelle and Edric, and Catrienne taught them a French carol, which was not in the curriculum, but was, she decided, cultural education, and therefore defensible. The Duke appeared in the schoolroom doorway, and stood there for the duration of the carol, and did not enter, and did not leave, and the expression on his face was the one that had been building since September, past assessment, past surprise, past respect, arrived now at something he could not file or manage or organize into a policy. Mrs. Thurley, watching from the corridor behind him, thought it was the first honest expression she had seen on this man since the Duchess had passed. On Christmas Eve, after the household dinner, after the children had been put to bed by Catrienne with the specific ritual they had developed together, Edric's book, Rosabelle's French prayer, the lavender on both their pillows, the Duke asked Catrienne to join him in the library. It was the first time he had asked her to be anywhere that was not related to the children. She understood the significance. She suspected he did too. The library was warm, the fire was low, and the shelves held the books she had come to know over 3 months, the agricultural manuals, the estate histories, and on the top shelf in the far corner, the small collection of novels that had belonged to the Duchess, which Catrienne had found in October and had not mentioned, because the dust on their spines told her everything she needed to know about what they meant to the man who could not move them. He poured 2 cups of tea himself, rather than ringing for Mrs. Thurley, and handed her one. This was so far outside the conventions of their positions that neither of them acknowledged it. "The children sang today," he said. They did. Rosabelle organized the younger ones into rows. She arranged them by height. "She has a gift for organization," Catrienne said. "She has your gift for organization," she corrected, and the correction was deliberate, and he heard it. He looked at the fire. "My wife would have loved today," he said. It was the first time he had mentioned the Duchess voluntarily, not as a policy, not as a grievance, not as the reason behind a rule, but as a person, as the woman who would have been there and was not, and whose absence had a specific shape that the day had outlined rather than filled. "Tell me about her," Catrienne said. "The children speak of her sometimes," she said, carefully, as though they are not sure whether they are permitted. I think they would speak of her more freely if they believed you could hear it. The silence was long. Her name was Marguerite, he said, and he told her. Not everything, not the illness, not the end, but the rest. The way she laughed, the way she read to the children every evening in French, because she was half French and believed that bedtime was for the language of the heart. The way she kept every room full of something growing, flowers in summer, herbs in autumn, forced bulbs in winter, because she could not tolerate a room without life in it. The way she argued with him about everything, and won most of the arguments, and did not keep score. He talked for 40 minutes. Catrienne listened. She did not interrupt. She held the space the way she held the corridor for Edric, with presence, without demand. When he finished, the fire was low, and the tea was cold, and the library was very quiet. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For telling me. The children will hear it eventually. Not from me, from you, when you are ready. But knowing who she was helps me understand who they are, and who you are." He set down his glass. "You already understand who I am, Miss Delvaux," he said. "I have been increasingly aware of that for some time." She looked at her glass. The corridor conversation returned to her, the one where he had named her precision as a distance, and she had deflected it, and the deflection had not worked. She was sitting in the Duke of Ashgrove's library on Christmas Eve, listening to him talk about his late wife, and that every rule she had constructed for herself in this position, every careful boundary, every professional distance, every precise distinction between what she was and what she was not, was still standing, technically, and was also no longer of any consequence. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. She stood. She curtsied, the same curtsy from the study, the one that acknowledged his authority fully and without resentment. And this time, when she rose, she held his gaze for one moment longer than she had in September. One beat past the professional register, and he saw it, and she knew he saw it, and neither of them said anything further. She left the library. He sat in the chair and looked at the fire, and at the shelf in the far corner where Marguerite's novels gathered dust, and thought about a governess who had sat with his son in the dark and taught his daughter to laugh, and had just listened to him talk about his wife for 40 minutes, without once making it about herself. He thought about the curtsy. He thought about the extra beat. He thought, this is what it looks like when everything you have organized begins to come apart, and the thing that is taking it apart is better than the thing you built. January brought the crisis. It arrived not as a dramatic event, but as a letter from the agency in Exeter, forwarded by Mrs. Thurley, with the compressed expression of a woman delivering news she wished she could have lost in the post. A family in Berkshire, a prominent family. They were offering Catrienne a position, head governess to 4 children, with a salary that was twice what Ashgrove paid, and the kind of social standing that a governess in a marquis's household carried, which was considerably more than a duke's household in Devonshire could offer. The letter had not come to Catrienne. It had come to the agency, which had forwarded it to Mrs. Thurley as a professional courtesy, which meant the Duke would know about it before Catrienne did. Mrs. Thurley's expression when she handed over the letter suggested this chain of events was not entirely accidental. The Duke learned about the offer on a Tuesday morning. Monsieur Thurley watched his face as he read and saw what she had expected. The assessment first, then the break beneath it. The moment where the information reached the part of him that was simply a father who had watched his children come back to life in the care of a woman he was about to lose. "When did this arrive?" he said. "This morning, Your Grace." "Has Miss Delvaux been informed?" "Not yet." He set the letter down. He looked at the window. The January garden was bare, the copper beech stripped to its winter architecture, the walled garden empty. "She will accept it," he said. It was not a question. "The position is exceptional. The salary alone," he stopped. "Send her to me," Mrs. Thurley did not move. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice carried something she very rarely allowed into it. Opinion. "Before you speak to her, may I ask what you intend to say?" "I intend to discuss the offer." "You intend to manage the situation," she said, "as you manage all situations. And I am asking, with the respect of 30 years, whether management is what is required." She held his gaze. "What is required is honesty, not about the position, about why the thought of her leaving is sitting on your face like something you cannot account for." She left the study. Catrienne came to the study. She stood in the same place she had stood in September. The portrait of Marguerite was still on the wall. The accounts were still on the desk. But everything between those two fixed points had changed. "You have received an offer," he said. "Mrs. Thurley informed me this morning. The position is significant." "It is." "You would be a fool not to accept it." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the letter on the desk between them, and his hands were flat on either side of it. And she understood that the hands were there, because if they were not flat on the desk, they would be doing something he could not control, and control was the last thing he had. "I have not said I would accept it," she said. He looked up. "The children," he said, and stopped. "The children," she said, "are the reason I have not said I would accept it." The sentence hung in the room. It said what it said. It also said what it didn't say, that the children were the reason she would give, and that there was another reason beneath, and she was not going to name it from her side of the room. He stood. He came around the desk and stopped at the distance that was correct. The distance between a duke and a governess. The distance that propriety required, and neither of them believed in anymore. "Catrienne," he said. Her name, not Miss Delvaux. Her name in his voice for the first time, and it changed the room the way a key changes a lock. Everything held in place by the old arrangement released. "If I asked you to stay," he said, "not as their governess." He looked at the portrait on the wall, and then at her, and the two women, the one in the painting and the one in the room, occupied the same space in his expression for a single moment, and then separated, and the one in the room was the one who remained. "Not as their governess," he said again. "As what, then?" she said. "As the person my children chose," he said, "before I had the sense to understand what they were choosing." She looked at him. September returned to her, the first curtsy, the one that had said, "I hear you, and I am going to meet your children." Then the corridor with Edric, Rosabel's voice at the assembly, Christmas Eve and the second curtsy, the same form held one beat longer, one beat past the professional boundary. She thought about what the third curtsy would mean if she gave it. She did not give it. She stepped forward, past the letter on the desk, past the distance that propriety required, and put her hand on his arm. "I am not staying because your children chose me," she said. "I am staying because I choose this. The children, the house, the copper beach, the corridor in the dark." She paused. "You." He covered her hand with his. The expression had nothing of September in it, nothing of the assessment, just him. The complete unguarded attention of a man who had spent 4 months having his architecture dismantled by a woman with lavender in her buttonhole and the steadiest hands he had ever seen. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It had the honesty of a man who had been revising his position since October and had arrived at a conclusion he was no longer willing to delay. She kissed him back with the same precision she brought to everything, to French grammar and sitting in dark corridors, and every true thing she had ever decided. And the study was warm, and the January light was thin and clear, and the portrait of Marguerite watched from the wall with the expression of a woman painted mid-thought, and the thought, Catrienne decided, was approval. When they separated, She kept her hand on his arm. "The children," she said. "They will need to be told." "Rosabelle will say she knew," he said. "Edric will ask a logistical question." She looked at him. "You know them very well." "I am learning to," he said. "I have had an exceptional teacher." She looked at the study, the desk, the accounts, the letter from Berkshire still sitting there, no longer of any consequence now. She looked at the man who had interviewed her in this room 4 months ago and told her that affection was not a substitute for discipline, and who was now standing with her hand on his arm and every policy he had ever constructed in thorough and irretrievable ruin. She curtsied. Not the September curtsy, the professional acknowledgement. Not the Christmas Eve one, the held beat. This one was slow and deep and deliberate, and it said everything the other two had been building toward. "I see you. I choose you. I am not leaving." She rose and looked at him directly, and he understood it completely. "Catrienne," he said, and her name in his voice had all of September and October and November and December in it, and none of it carried weight anymore. "Soren," she said. He took her hand. She let him take it. The January morning went on around them, thin and clear, and entirely indifferent to whether any of it had been practical. Rosabelle, when she was told, said, "I know." Edric, when he was told, said, "Will Miss Delvaux still teach us Latin?" The Duke looked at Catrienne. Catrienne looked at the Duke. "Yes," she said. "Latin will continue." Edric nodded, satisfied, and returned to his book with the settled certainty of a boy whose fixed points were holding, and who required nothing further. And the house, the old, creaking, grieving house that had been running on structure and fear for 14 months, settled into itself with the sound of something that was no longer being held together by effort alone. And the sound was quiet, and it was warm, and it was, at last, the sound of a place where people stayed.